It's yet,
Trump's got an 80% approval rating in Venezuela right now.
That's not true. And let me just tell you this.
Yeah.
Let me tell you this. The woman who was, the party who was legally elected in Venezuela is somewhere out in exile because he has made a pact with Maduro's number 2. And Maduro's worst executors are still running around free in Venezuela, terrorizing the Venezuelan people. There are still political prisoners. But he thought that he could, he used all sorts of scare tactics with Venezuela. He's using all sorts of scare tactics to tighten the screws on Cuba. But those are, smaller countries without a real military and really not much of an option but to fold. Iran is a completely different game, and I think these scare tactics of his just are not having the same effect because they have an incredible tolerance, more than I thought they would have, of enduring pain and pressure.
Anna Navarro and Scott Jennings are going at it on CNN over Trump's Iran strategy, his approval ratings, and whether pressure tactics that supposedly worked on Venezuela have any shot of working on a country with a real military. And I also want to share my take on this, because what you're about to watch isn't really a debate about foreign policy. It's a debate about whether facts matter when you've already decided on the answer. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know where you stand on this topic. Also, this channel is where we break down exactly these kinds of moments, the real argument underneath the argument that most people miss. If that's what you're looking for, hit the subscribe button. All right, let's get into it.
Trump's handling of the war in Iran. Those numbers are very similar to his handling of the job as a whole, with 65% of people disapproving. Will this go to help him or hurt him as he's continuing to do this thing where he says, I'm going to attack, okay, no, I'm not going to attack, and it's all been done sort of to the public, but not to Congress? Peter?
No, it's been done to the public, but that is also the fact that we're not sitting in the negotiation rooms, and whether that's happening in Islamabad, whether that's happening with emissaries from Qatar, from Oman, or whether that's in other channels that the U.S. has, we're only seeing the tip of this much more delicate regional and specific picture. Frankly, time is very much not on the Iranian side from their longevity as a regime. Time is also not on this administration side just when it comes to gas prices in the midterm. So the fact that the president is holding off, I think, does send a signal that there could be a far more significant development in the short term, especially coming on the heels of the president's trip to China, where Xi Jinping, very notably, and the Chinese government, Xi Jinping, does not like to get into domestic affairs of other countries because they don't want anyone talking about their Uyghur problem or anything else. Or I should say their horrific treatment of the Uyghurs and the human rights abuses. But Xi Jinping said Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. We agree on that component, and the Strait of Hormuz should be open. That's a very significant concession.
But he didn't offer anything to open.
What is he going to do?
But let me challenge that.
They are suffering economically. The Chinese retail consumption was 3 points off expectations yesterday. It was 0.2%, barely grew year over year.
I mean, there's a lot that China can do to pressure Iran.
Yeah.
I mean, including turning off their intel sharing with Iran to target American troops.
That would be
a big one.
But right now, the Chinese are suffering from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Of course.
Maybe not more than other folks in Asia, but certainly a heck of a lot more.
But I think this administration wanted to walk away from that summit with Xi Jinping with a win to say that, yes, the Chinese president is in fact going to put pressure on Iran. And they didn't get that.
There was additional daylight that grew up. While the Chinese, while Xi Jinping and Donald Trump were talking, the Iranians seized a Chinese flagged ship and impounded it. I mean, some of the messages coming out of Iran of like, this is a betrayal of the alliance that we had. I mean, that daylight, it may not be a mile wide, but if it was a crack, I mean, you can see to the other side.
I do want to mention that the Chinese Xi Jinping had said this before this meeting with Trump, that the Strait of Hormuz should be open. Obviously, China's suffering as well, in a much bigger way, even than the United States. And, that they would like to see a closure to this war.
But the nuclear component and Iran not being a nuclear power, that was a significant development.
Cornel, how do you see this?
Okay, so right out of the gate, you've got 65% of Americans disapproving of how Trump is handling Iran. That's not a rounding error. That is a supermajority of the country telling you something is not working. And Scott Jennings' response to that is essentially, the president is making a national security decision, not a political one, which sounds noble. Except the problem is, it is a political decision. It always is. The midterms are right there on the calendar. Gas prices are right there at the pump. You cannot cannot separate those things, and Jennings knows it. The other move that gets made here is the Xi Jinping play, this idea that China agreeing Iran shouldn't have nukes and that the Strait of Hormuz should stay open is some kind of major diplomatic win. I'll give him this much, it was a notable statement, but here's the thing. Agreeing on a principle is not the same as doing anything about it. And the fact that while Trump and Xi were literally in that meeting, Iran seized a Chinese-flagged ship, that detail gets buried fast. Don't let it. Now here's what you actually need to watch for in the next part. This is where Navarro stops talking strategy and goes straight at Trump's character as a negotiator. And that is a completely different fight.
And the way this war is being handled, because Americans are very, very concerned about it, especially since it's gone on far longer than they were expecting, than they were told.
You know, I always try to look at the world through the lens of the least of these, the people who are suffering the most vulnerable. And so when I look in Iran, I see people dealing with execution, subjugation, domination, repression. They're human beings like anybody else. I say the same thing about Gaza and genocide. I say the same thing about black folk in Harlem. Same thing about poor whites in Kentucky. There's got to be a moral and spiritual lens. And when you look through the world through moral and spiritual lens, which for me as a Christian, look at the world through the lens of the cross, it looks like you're always headed toward crucifixion. Because they're the ones who get crucified for the most part. You see, the everyday people, the poor people. And so we see the gangsters at the top, manipulating, playing power politics, crushing the people in their own respective contexts, and we end up with a dialogue that's deodorized at the top, that hiding the funk of the suffering and the unbelievable blood that's flowing. So in that sense, I have a critique across the board, but when I see the war, it's an illegal, it's an immoral war, but at the same time, I see a immoral regime in Iran. You see?
You're saying two things can be true at the same time.
Two things can be true at the same time.
How is this going to play out, you think, if this war continues to linger on? Obviously, the gas prices and all the cost of the war to the American public, to the regular person, hitting pretty hard. How do you see this playing out for the midterms? Do you think it's going to...
It's not good for Republicans. It's not good for Trump. I mean, the numbers don't lie, and the numbers have been fairly consistent. I don't know how many regular Americans who are trying to put food at the table, who are taking care of their children, who are working 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet, are really following every development of this war. I think most people are like, just wake me up when it's over, and it's not over. Every day it lingers on more and more. I also think, you know, when I see and read these threats by Trump, it's a little reminiscent of Taco, right? Trump always chickens out. It's a little this is the same guy who threatened Iran with complete eradication of their civilization during the Easter weekend. So it's like the little president who cried wolf a little too much. And I think something we can all agree on is that the messaging around this war has been disorganized, undisciplined, and not very effective. And I think that this zigzagging and threatening and screaming, you know, at the kids in the yard by Trump doesn't help the messaging issue.
Do you think it's been disorganized and the messaging just kind of all over the place?
Look, I think the president's been pretty clear. His number one objective is he does not want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. That's been his top priority. He said it again today. He says it virtually every day. He didn't really make a political decision. He made a national security decision, which is what we elect commanders in chief to do. He decided that they were on the brink of getting a nuclear weapon. He wasn't going to permit it. It's his red line, and he is enforcing it. And he's really sort of set politics aside. I mean, the polling is pretty clear on it, but he has kind of set politics aside and said, I can't worry about politics all the time. Sometimes I have to worry about national security, and that's his choice. And a lot of this rests on his shoulder.
So this is where the debate shifts, and most people watching won't even notice when it happens. Cornel West comes in with the moral lens, the cross, the poor, the people getting crushed by the people at the top. And look, that framing lands, it is real. But then Ana Navarro drops something that cuts to the bone. She says Trump thinks he can pressure Iran the same way he pressured Venezuela, a smaller country with no real military and not much of an option but to fold. And then she lays out exactly why that logic falls apart. Scott Jennings pushes back and says the messaging has been clear. No nuclear weapons, that's the red line. And I'll be honest, that part is true. Trump has been consistent on that specific point. But Jennings is doing something slippery here. He's taking the one thing Trump has been consistent about and using it to wave away everything else. The zigzagging, the threats, the Easter weekend eradication talk. You cannot point to one steady note and pretend the whole song has been disciplined. That is not how any of this works. What nobody has an answer for yet is the Venezuela comparison Navarro makes, and she makes it with receipts. The woman who is legally elected in Venezuela is in exile. Maduro's executors are still walking free, and Trump's got an 80% approval rating there? In the next part, Jennings reaches for that exact stat, and what happens next exposes the whole thing. If you've watched this far, you already know what kind of channel this is. Subscribe if it's yours. We go this deep every time.
Respectfully, if I might disagree regarding chickening out, I don't think the top level of the Iranian regime that we took out in the opening hours of this war would think that he chickened out. Probably don't see it that way right now. We inflicted massive military damage against the top layer of Iranian leadership, against their military sites, and so on and so forth. We have sunk their navy. We have set them back years upon years upon years in terms of what they would like to do to be able to export terror around the world. The final thing is, can you get to a deal where you can guarantee to the American people no nuclear weapons for these butchers? If we get there, that is a victory, and I think if we get there soon, the American people will see that as a good thing.
He can use pressure tactics like he did in Venezuela, like
Which
he's
worked.
doing. Like he's doing, they did.
Well, this is a very different country.
He took Maduro out, but there's still political prisoners there, and a lot of
Alex
the
Saab was
Venezuela.
just extradited
So do not
today.
claim that Venezuela is a victory. It's not. It's yet.
Trump's got an 80% approval rating in Venezuela right now.
That's not true. And let me just tell
it's
you
true,
this.
yeah.
Let me tell you this. The woman who was, the party who was legally elected in Venezuela is
Chelsea
somewhere out in
Rodriguez.
exile because he has
Marina.
made a pact with Maduro's number two. And Maduro's worst executors are still running around free in Venezuela, terrorizing the Venezuelan people. There are still political prisoners. But he thought that he could, he used all sorts of scare tactics with Venezuela. He's using all sorts of scare tactics to tighten the screws on Cuba. But those are, smaller countries without a real military and really not much of an option but to fold. Iran is a completely different game, and I think these scare tactics of his just are not having the same effect because they have an incredible tolerance, more than I thought they would have, of enduring pain and pressure.
Butchery. You got butchery in Gaza. You got butchery on the West Bank. You got butchery in Tehran. You got butchery going on. If all we do is just butchery, is butchery all the way down. What does that mean? It's over. People reach a point where they have a contempt for humanity. We no longer have the capacity to express love, care, and concern for others, let alone the least of these. That's what's sad. It's butchery all the way down, though, brother.
But in our case, we're taking on the butchers. The case of
but
Iran's
America
regime,
has this history of butchery, too.
They butcher their own people. They drag them out into the street.
That's
They
true.
hang them.
That's
They behead
true.
them.
40,000 this year.
If women
That's true.
don't wear the right clothes, or they take
true.
off their.
That's exactly right. We got butchery and slavery and Jim Crow and lynching. We got butchery in Gaza. You got butchery in Venezuela. You got, this is Jonathan Swift all the way down. All right, we're on the way to misanthropy.
Should we have looked the other way on Iran?
I think that we could come up with ways of minimizing the butchery.
You know what, on that,
Yes.
Here is the single thing this whole exchange proves that Scott Jennings cannot walk back. He says, and I am telling you to lock in on this moment, Trump's got 80% approval rating in Venezuela right now. That is the stat he reaches for to defend Trump's pressure tactic playbook, and Ana Navarro dismantles it in under 60 seconds. She does not yell, she does not dodge, she just tells you what actually happened. The woman who was legally elected in Venezuela is in exile. Maduro's worst executors are still running free. Political prisoners are still sitting in cells. And Scott Jennings is calling that an 80% approval rating? That is not a counterargument. That is a man in a corner grabbing the first number he can find and hoping nobody checks it. And here is what makes it worse. This is not a minor statistical dispute. This is the entire logic of Trump's Iran strategy sitting on top of the Venezuela comparison. If Venezuela worked, then pressure works, then Iran will eventually fold. That is the chain of reasoning Jennings needs you to accept, and Navarro just cut the first link clean off, because Venezuela did not work the way Jennings says it did. The numbers he cited, even if you take them at face value, do not describe a free country with a legitimate government. They describe a population that has no other option. And Iran, with a real military, with a nuclear enrichment program, with an 80-year institutional memory of foreign interference in their country, is not Venezuela. That comparison does not hold, and the whole argument collapses with it. Now, zoom out for a second, because what this argument is really about is something every American is feeling right now, whether they follow foreign policy or not. Gas prices. That is the connective tissue here. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of global oil shipments. That is not a talking point. That is the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Any disruption there hits inflation. Inflation hits groceries. It hits your commute. It hits the family trying to make it to the end of the month on 2 incomes. And when Navarro says the numbers don't lie and that this war has gone on far longer than people were told it would, that is not a political attack. That is the kitchen table talking. Most Americans, according to Pew and Gallup data, rank cost of living over foreign policy escalation when asked to choose. That is the midterm math playing out in real time, and it is why Scott Jennings, he made a national security decision, not a political one, line lands so hollow. Of course it's political. Everything a president does 18 months before a midterm is political. Saying otherwise is not depth, it's spin. Now the moral piece. Cornel West's contribution to this segment is something I actually want to sit with for a second, because he is doing something different from everyone else in the room. He is not arguing strategy, he is arguing humanity. He is saying that when you use the word butchery to describe Iran's regime, which, let's be clear, is accurate, they execute people for not wearing the right clothes, you have to be willing to apply that same word consistently. Butchery in Gaza, butchery in Venezuela, butchery in Jim Crow, butchery all the way down. And his point is not that you should therefore do nothing. His point is that moral language cannot be selective. You cannot invoke it only when it serves the policy you already wanted to run. And nobody in that panel has a real answer to that. Jennings tries with, but in our case, we're taking on the butchers, which is a genuine point. The Iranian regime's human rights record is documented and it is horrific, but he does not address the consistency question. He just moves on. So who had the stronger argument here? I am going to give it to Anna Navarro, and here is exactly why. Jennings had one job in this segment: defend the logic of Trump's approach to Iran, and the logic he chose to stand on was the Venezuela comparison. Navarro did not try to out-argue him on Iran policy in the abstract. She went after the foundation. She showed you the Venezuela story is not what Jennings says it is. And once that foundation cracks, every building sitting on top of it, the pressure tactics work, the messaging is clear, the president is making a national security decision, not a political one, all of it wobbles. That is how you win a debate. You do not have to beat every point, you just have to beat the one the other person cannot afford to lose, and she beat it clean. Now, Jennings' best moment, I will give it to him, was the nuclear red line point. The idea that Trump has been consistent about one thing, no nuclear weapons for Iran, is true, and the non-proliferation experts at the International Atomic Energy Agency will tell you that is actually the right line to hold, because once a country hits nuclear breakout capacity, your diplomatic leverage drops off a cliff. That is a real argument. The problem is Jennings uses it to justify every other thing: the inconsistent messaging, the threats, the chickening out accusation from Navarro, the Venezuela stat that doesn't check out. One solid argument does not cover that much ground. Here's where I land. You have a president with 65% disapproval on Iran handling, a pressure playbook built on a Venezuela comparison that falls apart under basic scrutiny, gas prices that are hitting families right now, and a midterm clock that is already running. And the question this whole debate forces you to answer is this: if the pressure tactic does not work on Iran the way it allegedly worked on Venezuela, and the evidence is starting to suggest it will not, at what point does the American public decide the cost is too high? Is there a version of this where no deal gets made, Iran does not get a nuclear weapon, the war just keeps lingering, gas keeps climbing, and Trump still gets credit because he took on the butchers? Or does the American public eventually say, enough? That is the real question sitting at the bottom of everything you just watched. And I want to know, do you think the pressure-first approach can actually force a deal with Iran? Or is Ana Navarro right that Iran is a completely different game? These conversations are happening whether we pay attention or not. I'm going to keep breaking them down. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.